once was a union maid. She never was afraid of goons and ginks and company finks and the deputy sheriffs who made the raid. She went to the union hall when a meeting it was called, and when the Legion boys come round, she always stood her ground. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union till the day I die.
When we think of the development of the union movement in Canada, this is a typical picture that comes to mind. Men engaged in collective organizing. They are the members of the Mine, Mill and Smelter Workers, Local 598, in Sudbury, Ontario, on the eve of their first strike in 1958, a strike that was to last a long and bitter 13 weeks. Here they are in their union hall, getting ready to hit the picket line the next morning. The local had close to 18,000 members, employed by Falconbridge Limited and the International Nickel Company. They were all men, except during the war years when women were enlisted to work in the smelter. A picture like this is deceiving because it leads us to believe that only men were involved in the many strikes of mine, mill and smelter workers, and in the birth and development of Local 598, and in the trade union movement in general. Nothing could be further from the truth. Women working hard, very hard, not as paid workers in their own locals and unions, but as unpaid workers in formal associations with men's trade unions, played a fundamental role in developing the labor movement we have inherited today. This is Kirkland Lake, the winter of 1941, 40 below temperatures. The picket of wives and children of the gold miners marched in protest because the company had refused to recognize the union. There might have been a few men, but this was a line predominantly of women and children. It stretched a full 2 miles long. 20 years after this picket, the National Coordinator of Women's Auxiliaries of Mine, Mill and Smelter Workers recalled in her newsletter,
"Remember and salute those men and women of Kirkland Lake 20 years ago who gave everything they had in that struggle and then went on from there. Wherever they went, they did their share in building this wonderful union of ours, and in many cases are still doing so. To all of them, wherever they are, here's to Mine Mill."
The picket and the men's strike that followed is credited with ushering in the federal legislation in 1944, which assured union recognition as the legal means of establishing working terms and conditions with employers. This fundamental piece of legislation was the first in Canada to require employers to bargain with organized workers. Without it, contemporary unions could not count on being able to negotiate with employers. Since the end of the 19th century, women whose husbands, fathers, and sons were members of skilled trade unions formed themselves into women's auxiliaries. Here are women of the Auxiliary of the Mine, Mill and Smelter Workers in the kitchen of one of the union halls. The kitchen was very large, with several ovens and multiple sinks for many hands to be working at once. With a minimum of 10 women, a group could apply for a charter and establish a mine mill auxiliary local. By 1946, there were 25 Canadian auxiliary locals of the Mine, Mill and Smelter Workers. In this photo are the women of Auxiliary Local 117 in Sudbury. Now, some would argue that the work of these women was invisible, that it was the men in their locals that were leading the struggle for the working class. The women themselves, in all likelihood, did not consider themselves or their work to be invisible. Neither were they troubled by the question of whether their work was political or personal. For them, it was both.
I am one of those women. My name is Dorothy MacDonald. Here I am standing beside the president of the Mine Mill Union Local in my hometown of Timmins. I know what it means to work hard. At the age of 17, I held 3 jobs to support myself and my father, who was a casualty of the Great Depression, and my youngest sister, who was disabled from birth. In the 1950s and early 1960s, I was the national coordinator of all the Canadian auxiliary locals. The auxiliaries I coordinated were spread across the country, wherever there was a man's mine mill local.
Here is a group from the auxiliary local in Trail, BC in 1952. They organized a demonstration to rally support for Mine Mill. To credit their activities, Dorothy wrote in the auxiliary newsletter,
This is an experience that none of you will ever forget, nor will you ever look back and regret. It's wonderful to be able to walk with our heads up and to be able to look anyone in the eye honestly and be able to say, I did my little bit too. We belong to the same family, and our motto has always been one for all and all for one. Let us never forget that the 35,000 members who compose Mine Mill in Canada are the real bosses of this wonderful union. But I ask, is each of us doing our utmost to further the growth of our organization and to make it as strong as possible? It is a question worth considering because we can't ride on the other person's push. We have to do our own pushing. Let's think it over and decide on ways to make our auxiliary grow in membership and meaning throughout Canada and the US.
building and sustaining a labor movement is a collective effort. In addition to supporting strikes by putting on suppers at union halls and bringing food and clothing to picket lines, the auxiliaries also did other kinds of work within elaborate and enduring formal organizations of the auxiliary locals. Each auxiliary local collected monthly dues from their members. Each auxiliary member was issued a membership book that tracked the payment of their dues. Each month, when a woman paid her dues, the financial secretary stamped her booklet. This member is all paid up for the 12 months of 1957. The booklets were the same as those used for the men in their locals. We see the red union seal in the middle of the inside cover here, along with the member's name and the auxiliary local number. The auxiliaries used the same formal mechanisms and procedures used by the men's locals, but they had their own constitution, their own conventions to which they funded delegates to attend.
In Mine Mill, the auxiliary delegates are allowed seats, voice, and vote in the union convention. Our union brothers visiting from Wales say that in this, we are far ahead of the other unions in Britain. We're far ahead of any other union anywhere as far as that goes, and I think we must appreciate the fact more and more and make full use of it in the future. We have a lot of strength when we take a united stance against tyranny.
Here's a small working group of delegates elected from their locals at their 1961 convention. Each local had its own resolutions committee that would put forward resolutions to the national conventions for the delegates to vote on. Their political agenda was far-reaching indeed. They organized letter-writing campaigns and sent postcards to the members of Parliament, traveled to Ottawa to make presentations to Senate and Commons committees on legislative changes, or to make their views known on atomic bomb testing and world disarmament.
I'd just like to remind our Canadian sisters to step up their protests against the passage of Bill 7. or should I say against the contemplated passage of said Bill 7, because if it's allowed to pass, we'll have McCarthyism in Canada, and no mistake. We also need to put a lot of pressure on the powers that be for more and better schools instead of bigger and better bombs.
Here's a page from an auxiliary member's notebook, probably jotted down during a meeting by the secretary of one of the auxiliary locals. It's entitled "The Program for the Coming Year." There's no date, but other evidence indicates it's about 1952. The items of the program include price control, political action and legislation, childcare, teenage problems, community work, health, housing, and world peace. Auxiliary women organized rummage sales, teas, bake sales, and bazaars to raise funds. They used their financial autonomy to engage and support activities they thought were important. They donated auxiliary funds to many different kinds of social and political causes: flood relief, the Cancer Society, and parcels of food and clothing to be shipped to hospitals. Here's a picture of an auxiliary member and the arthritis car the auxiliary helped to fund, which paid visits to local arthritis sufferers. These broad social issues that had to do with justice, health, and well-being were never seen as entirely divorced from the issues taken up at the bargaining table by the men.
Our auxiliaries were in the forefront of the fight for equal pay for equal work for women, just as we have been among the first to demand a national health plan for Canada. It's about time for all of us to stand up and be counted and declare which side we are on.
Auxiliaries organized meetings to educate other women on topics such as the pasteurization of milk, changes in the sales tax, and jury duty responsibilities. In the work auxiliary women did, they challenged the assumption that union struggles took place at the bargaining table alone, under the steam of men alone. Their consumer action, education, and political participation were essential to the creation of a new political and social order, an order in which labor unions could be expected to thrive.
If you are tempted to buy Westinghouse products, don't until this strike has been won by Local 504. United Electrical Workers Union have always supported Mine Mill wholeheartedly in all of our struggles. Let's do the same for them. Have the courage of your convictions. Just don't be scared of the big stick the boss is waving.
An effective labor movement, so these women thought, must concern itself with every aspect of working and social life. One of the explicit mandates in the auxiliaries' constitution was to provide educational and cultural activities for children. Auxiliary locals organized sports teams, set up their own libraries, and held Christmas parties for the children in the mining communities. The Sudbury Auxiliary Local was especially active in cultural activities. They ran a summer camp for children and had their own ballet school. They offered scholarships for children to go to summer programs at the Banff School of Fine Arts. The local had their own acting troupe. The Hayward Players, as they called their acting group of auxiliary and union members, performed not just for union events, but also traveled to provincial amateur drama competitions, oftentimes walking away with awards. Each auxiliary local had their own educational committee charged with the responsibility of hosting film nights and discussion circles. Often educational and social activities were combined. Gender politics cut across and ran throughout activities jointly carried out by auxiliary and union members. Here are women and men in the kitchen of the Union Hall getting ready for a fundraising meal. The women are doing the work, the men are looking on. When men did chip in with all the work that went into these kinds of events, it was reported in the National Auxiliary newsletter.
It did my heart good to see that the men folk had taken over the kitchen and cloakroom, leaving all auxiliary members free to have a wonderful time.
While the auxiliaries were formally considered a central part of the Union, they were not always treated as such by their Union brothers. In addition to their political work outside of the Union, women's auxiliaries fought the gendered politics inside the Union.
Did you know that if you are a married woman with 3 children, that you work a 74-hour week? It's true, according to a survey made recently among 1,800 women. The survey was conducted to establish the economic value of a woman's work in the home. She's lucky if it's only a 74-hour week, say I.
Even though the division of labor was a highly gendered one, with women at the kitchen tables and men at the bargaining tables, many auxiliary women and some of their union brothers recognized that auxiliary women's unpaid work was crucial to building a labor movement. They realized the gains made by trade unions, which brought higher wages and endowed workers with some control over their working conditions, were only possible because of women like those in this photo. As we cast our eyes back to the labor movement during the war and post-war years, some of us might think the role of unpaid auxiliary women, such as Dorothy MacDonald, was a marginal role. Their work wasn't paid work, and it didn't involve negotiating collective agreements with employers. But all the work they did, the work that was visible and the work that was invisible, the work that followed the gender scripts of the times and the work that didn't follow the gender scripts, it all contributed to the labor movement we have today. It's a labor movement that can now boast of equal rates of unionization for men and women. This was not the case even 2 decades ago, when a greater proportion of working men were unionized in comparison to working women. We have much to learn from these foremothers of ours, and we certainly have much to thank them for.
She couldn't be fooled by a company stool. She'd always organize the guys. She'd always get her way. When she struck for better pay, she'd show her card to the National Guard, and this is what she'd say. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union till the day I die.